Welcome everybody to our property tax panel at this year's Texas Policy Summit. I was thinking back just a few years ago to when I first started back in 2008. And I can tell you that not only has the foundation changed in that time, but so has the movement. And I am so impressed by the quality of the program that's been put on this year and also the energy that I've seen from everybody. I really do think we are on the cusp of the most conservative session in my time, at least, which of course spans almost 2 decades, and perhaps even in modern memory. I really do believe that. And so I want to say thank you to everybody in this room and everybody watching online for making that possible. Now, today we're going to delve into kind of a meaty issue, property taxes, and we'll start high level and kind of go on down. But before we get into that particular issue, I'm James Quintero. I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. You'll most often see me throwing stones at local governments for things like high taxes and too much debt and onerous regulations. And I am very fortunate to be joined by 3 prestigious members of the Texas Legislature, the Texas House specifically. None of them needs an introduction, but very quickly I'll go through. To my left, we have Chairman Morgan Meyer. Chairman, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
To his left, we have Representative Troxclair, who has been a longtime colleague of mine and is a former senior fellow here at the foundation. Ellen, thank you for being here. And then, of course, we have Representative Hugh, who does yeoman's work on the House Ways and Means Committee and, of course, has a very good grasp on all things fiscal policy. Representative Hugh, thank you for being here, sir. So before we get into some of the nuts and bolts of what's unfolding at the legislature, I kind of want to take the temperature of the members on stage and really ask what you guys are hearing in your districts. Are property taxes top of mind for constituents in your areas? And Chairman, we'll start with you.
Sure, I think that's true, and thank y'all for having me here. I know all 3 of us are proud to be here this morning, and absolutely and without question, and it doesn't matter where you travel in the state. I represent up in the Dallas area, whether you are in Dallas, or I'm originally from Lubbock, or if you're in Lubbock, or if you're in San Antonio, or wherever, property tax relief is by far and away the #1 issue, and it's not a Republican issue, and it's not a Democrat issue. It is a Texas issue, and that is something that we are going to address. So by far and away, I know that is on top of mind for all Texans.
Ellen, are you hearing anything on property taxes?
Of course, and this is why I woke up one day and decided to run for the Austin City Council as a young, very conservative person, and so of course that was my passion thing when I originally ran for city council, was like, where is all this money going? How are people, including my family, going to afford our growing property taxes each year, because we weren't getting an 8% raise year over year. Thanks to the legislature, they passed Senate Bill 2 that is going to get municipal spending under control a little bit. But the good news is that a lot of important changes have been made. The bad news is ultimately we can tell from being on the campaign trail that the voters haven't necessarily felt as big of an impact as the legislature, I think, originally intended, because they're still asking, 8 years later, well, where's that property tax relief? Where's that property tax reform? So I'm really excited about the proposals that Chairman Meyer and others have put forward to make a huge dent in our property taxes.
Representative Shine, are you hearing anything out your way?
Oh, absolutely. Returning to the legislature over 6 years ago, as a business person and being involved in the community, when I returned, I said, I'm going to come to Austin for policy purposes. And the #1 issue, even back then, was the property tax issue affecting business as well as individuals. And understanding the process that we have to how we fund government is critical. But the other thing that I hear too is helping people understand how the system works, why it works the way that it does, and find solutions to try to bring more transparency and accountability to the process. And I've tried to focus on that as well as a number of other issues. But those are important in the process because a lot of times when people don't understand how the system and the mechanisms work, it makes it even more fearful for them. And one of the biggest problems we have that I hear from folks is when they walk in to protest their appraisals is the feeling of intimidation that they have. And that we have to get that cleaned up. And we've been working on that. And as you know, I've got a work group that we've had now for 6 years. You've participated with us some on that. And we meet through the interim discussing these issues and bringing things to fruition. We've come up with some pretty good issues over the last 6 years, too.
I think that's right on target, Representative. You know, one of the ways that I kind of gauge things is by the diversity of voices that I see calling for property tax relief. And one of the things that I've taken note of over the last year or so is I think folks on the more progressive side of the issue have really highlighted this issue, and that's very telling to me. And I just want to read a few quotes. You know, Representative Donna Howard, who I very much respect, I don't align with on issues necessarily, but I very much respect her. She was in the Austin American-Statesman earlier this year, and she said, you know, if we also address buying down the tax rate, we can actually increase overall school taxes. Which I don't necessarily, you know, I think that tax rate compression idea is right on target. You know, Representative Chris Turner, who I also respect but don't necessarily align with, said, you know, we want to relieve pressure on homeowners so that we can deliver additional homestead exemption increases. You know, I might agree or disagree on that approach, but the fact that they are talking, some very high-ranking members of the progressive side are talking about tax relief is quite telling to me. And so to the panel, I just want to ask, you know, given what seems to be widespread support among the body, should we all expect that we are going to walk away from this session having achieved the biggest tax cut in Texas history?
Yes, without question. There is no doubt in my mind that is something we're going to achieve. I will say this is my second term as chairman of Ways and Means, and I have said this privately, and I'll say it publicly as well. Our committee is by far one of the most, if not the most, bipartisan committee. Because to your point, as it relates to the quotes you just referred to, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, this property tax issue or overall tax issue is not a Republican issue, it's not a Democrat issue, it's a Texan issue. And so, therefore, 100%, we will deliver the largest tax cut in the history of the state of Texas.
That's very encouraging. So, Representative Shine, I want to kick it over to you for just a minute, and if you would, I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page when it comes to the state's finances, because we find ourselves in a rather unique position. And I was hoping you might be able to articulate where it is that we are right now and just how well the state is financially.
Well, I would say we're in very good shape financially. I certainly want to echo the comments made by my chairman, Chairman Meyer, that yes, we're going to deliver, but it's not just this session that we're delivering. We started delivering about 6 years ago, and even maybe before that as well with some of the things we did. You know, the economics of the state is what drives a lot of the issues that we're dealing with right now. It's driving, especially on the property tax code. The corporate expansions that we're seeing in Texas, the relocations that are coming to Texas, they're the result of economic incentives, and some of that which ceased in December the 31st had an impact on the growth that we've had. So we don't have an income tax in Texas. That's an attraction. That's an attraction for individuals to come to Texas and to work here. We have a very business-friendly economic regulatory environment. The quality of life in Texas and the cost of living that we have here in Texas, very attractive as well. Let me go on, because the economics are critical. Our highways, our ports, our airports, all that expansion of infrastructure is bringing more business and more people here. For example, we have the largest highway system in the entire United States. We have to maintain it. And the other part of that is NAFTA. 80% of NAFTA comes through here, and Texas is the gateway to Central and South America. We have to recognize these things, and being a military guy, the most important thing you do is you set the circumstances and the situation. And that's what I'm laying out for you right now. Our oil and gas industry, the impact that we have on the United States and the world, and then businesses and people desire to live here. Education, our job opportunities, all of that is important. And think about this from the economics. This property tax system we have created in 1980 by the Pivotal Bill. 4 years after that property tax, and what we did is we standardized appraisals and put appraisal districts in. We had Edgewood versus Kirby. We'll talk about compression. We'll talk about what that did to schools and funding. And the legislatures had to deal with that, and the courts took charge of that in the late 80s, early 90s, and until House Bill 3 came and we did compression, we had to deal with that in the courts, and House Bill 3 actually put that back in the hands of the state legislature, which is exactly where it should have been. So though I think the economic environment is something that we have to look at when we start talking about this, because that has more influence and impact on the decisions that we make as we go forward.
Well, and I think you're right on, Representative Shine. Let me shift gears a little bit, because of course Speaker Phelan made some big news yesterday. He articulated the House's vision for property tax relief. And Mr. Chairman, I want to see if you can kind of help us understand some of the nitty-gritty about what Speaker Phelan outlined and how that might affect the average homeowner and or business owner.
Sure, and I was proud to file HB 2 yesterday, which I believe the Speaker was referring to yesterday in his remarks, and it's the House's vision on how we're going to reduce property taxes. And what we are doing is we are providing total with House Bill 1 and House Bill 2, $17.3 billion in tax rate compression. And what that means is that in House Bill 2, it's about a 15-cent compression, and combined with House Bill 1, it's a 10-cent compression. And I'll make sure that I'm clear on this. So I brought a card in that if it was just HB 2, the reduction, the average reduction would be $461 in year 1 and $590 in year 2. But when you take HB 1 and HB 2 together, it's actually $542 in year 1 and $733 in year 2. And so that's a pretty big leap. It's a pretty big push forward. I understand we had $15 billion in our base budget. We're actually going above and beyond that to that $17.3 billion number, because we believe the taxpayers of the state of Texas deserve that. Additionally, we are, and I know this is a point of discussion, we've coupled that with appraisal caps and reducing the appraisal cap as it relates to residential property to 5%, and then as it relates to all property as well, having an appraisal cap of 5% where before there was no appraisal cap, because we want to provide that type of relief to all Texans. It is certainly important to homeowners such as myself and everyone in this room, but we also want to provide it to small business owners. We also want to provide it to farmers and ranchers, because right now, as a small business owner, I have heard from many in my district, there's a ton of uncertainty. They understand what the taxes are related to their employees. They understand what the taxes are related to their business, but every year there's a huge uncertainty because their taxes on their commercial property could go up by whatever amount. Now we're providing certainty for them, which is necessary. We're providing property tax relief to all. And so that was very important to us, because I will tell you, James, and you and I spoke earlier, when I'm at my son's fourth grade basketball game, or I'm at the grocery store, I'm at dinner with my wife, people are coming up to me, and what they are telling me is, what is going on with my appraisal? Like, what is that? That is what I am hearing, my appraisal, my appraisal, my appraisal. Now, I understand there's, on the Senate side, there's the homestead exemption. And look, as the Speaker said, the door is always open. But I will tell you, in 8 years of doing this, I've never had one person come up to me at my son's basketball game and say, Morgan, why is my homestead exemption not bigger? And so we really want to tackle the appraisal issue. We really do. We want to couple it with the tax compression to provide some certainty go forward, because the tax compression is very important. But we want to couple that with some certainty on a go-forward basis to where, whether it's commercial or residential, that all property owners know that their appraisal can only increase by 5%.
Representative Shine, Troxclair, do you guys have any?
Go ahead,
Well,
Ellen.
I'll just jump in because, James, you know that I'm a big fan of homestead exemptions, and Austin didn't have one before I ran for the city council, and now we have a 20% homestead exemption in Austin. So it is absolutely a good and important tool in the toolbox that most municipalities and the state have used. However, it has limitations because it doesn't benefit businesses or renters. And so it can't be the only thing that we do. We are not going to see the largest property tax decrease in history if we only depend on a homestead exemption. We have to utilize everything that Chairman Meyer just talked about. And so I am absolutely thrilled with the House's proposal to really address the root of the issues. You know, homestead exemption, it gets more to the absolute root of the issue and benefits everybody, business owners and renters and homeowners. So I really appreciate that you are pushing the limit, pushing the number up a little bit more from 15 to 17 billion, because ultimately that $33 billion that we have in our state surplus, it is a once in a lifetime opportunity. I mean, when the comptroller tells you, I cannot overstate the amount of our surplus, and this will never happen again. We have an absolute responsibility to make sure that we're grasping this opportunity, and it's really the perfect storm. Thanks to our business climate, thanks to the way that the state handled COVID and getting people back open as quickly as possible, that is what has allowed us to have that huge surplus. And so we have an amazing opportunity to give that money back to the taxpayers in form of property tax relief. So I'm just really grateful for the House's leadership on this issue.
Please, sir.
You got to go back and look at history, and I think that's important in building the basis for where you go forward from. The way the appraisal system worked back in the 70s before the Pivotal bill was disastrous, to say the least. And so when the Pivotal bill was passed in 1980, basically we depoliticized the appraisal process, and we brought professionalism into the appraisal process. Now, I will say this, that the mechanics consist of, in the appraisal process, constitutional, when we're talking about equal and uniform. And that needs to be preserved and protected in the entire process when we look at appraisals. I want to talk a little bit about the appraisal, because a fixed dollar amount, which is what we use and have used, is for homestead exemptions, in my opinion, doesn't keep pace with the rapidly rising property values. The creep effect, I think, is what we call. And one of the things that I'm going to propose this session, and have not had an opportunity to really spend a lot of time discussing it yet, is to use a percentage of the average home value in a county for residential homestead exemptions to look at that. And what's nice about that is you can have a floor and use a percentage rate, not a fixed. So that as home prices continue to rise, or home appraisals continue to rise, so does the exemption that the individuals receive. And we as a legislative body don't have to come back every 2 years based on what the economy is doing to the situation. And we've gone from 25 to 40. Now we're going to 70. Don't disagree with that. What I try to look at is what we are doing. How can we do it maybe a little better? Okay? But we need to do that, because I think our focus needs to continue to be on exemptions, compression like we're talking about. I can tell you right now that House Bill 3 and House Bill 2, as the chairman mentioned a moment ago, we've only had about 4 years of that into effect. It's working. We need to give it a little bit more time to continue to work, and I think it's going to have a dramatic impact. For example, prior to House Bill 2, or Senate Bill 2, municipalities were increasing on the average of about 6.5%. Now they're increasing budgets by about 4.1%. Okay, so that tells me it's working. We need a little bit more time for that to work as well. But here's the other thing that we have to do. We have got to not only make the best, in my opinion, the best system in the country that we have, we've got to look at more accountability. We've got to look at more transparency. We've got to work out at the efficiency within the administration of how the appraisal district works. And we've got to focus more on the education of those who are in the appraisal district, like the Appraisal Review Board. That we've got appraisal review board that's scattered across 254 counties that have different ways of working, and we need some continuity with that. And the last thing is, we've got to communicate to the taxpayers that we hear from of how the system works more clearly, how it can be used more effectively for them, and those are things I think we need to focus and concentrate on as we go forward.
And if I can jump in on that point, one thing that we worked together on a few years ago was a taxpayer impact statement to get that clarity to the taxpayers, because no matter how hard the state works at the legislature to tackle this issue, we can only do so much because it's the local taxing entities that ultimately are setting those tax rates and contributing to a large part of your bill. So, but it's hard to explain this. It's hard to have an in-depth conversation with however many, Texans about what all of their taxing entities. They get their tax bill and they're mad about that final number. And so we passed, when I was on the city council, we passed a taxpayer impact statement that was a one-page, plain English, very clear. Here is why your taxes are going up. Here's what's contributing to it. That included utility bill fees. That included the total absolute thing, and it was on one page where people could easily understand it. And they have continued that today, and it might be something that we could work on together to make sure that that taxpayers have access to the easy information, that easy explanation of what all is going into their tax bills.
No, I think that item is excellent. I want to return back real quick to this issue of the House and Senate plans. One of the things that I noticed when both chambers introduced their budgets is that if you looked at Rider 81, the language providing the tax relief was actually fairly similar. There was only a little bit of a difference there. And I believe that was the Senate outlined the $3 billion set aside for the homestead exemption increase. So for folks on the outside like myself, I thought, okay, folks are largely in agreement here. Now it looks like things are taking a little bit of a turn where the House has one idea, the Senate has another idea. Do you think we're still largely on the same page and we're just kind of, these are minor differences, or is it a major difference?
I mean, I think they're just different approaches. And every session that we come in, whether it's property tax relief or whatever the issue may be, the House and the Senate might have a different vision, might have a different idea, and then we work together. I mean, that's the whole point of this, is that, as Ellen correctly stated, is that we're going to utilize, homestead exemption is still in the conversation. We're going to take a look at every tool. You cannot limit yourself, because ultimately I think we all want to get to the same place, which is providing, as I stated, the largest property tax relief that we can in the history of state of Texas. So I think we will work together, and we will certainly get there. And just as, I'm sure the Senate had the best intentions with the homestead exemption. But we're taking a different view of it. We are taking a different route, but that doesn't mean that ultimately we'll not end up at the same goal, because we in the House understand that this is we work together in our job, all of us, our job, whether we're working with other members in the House or working with the Senate, is to work together, especially on this particular issue, to provide the largest property tax relief that we can.
And I think that's well said, Chairman. This is some of this is just part of the natural sausage-making process. I want to shift gears a little bit, though, because I do believe y'all are right on target. We are going to achieve the biggest tax cut in Texas history. The question then becomes, how do we guard our gains, right? What are the reforms that the body is going to entertain that ensures that local governments don't erode whatever tax relief is provided by the legislature? And Representative Shino, you mentioned SB 2, which we championed. We thought was a transformational change. Very proud to support that bill. Even still, I do believe there are ways to strengthen SB 2. Do you see any ways that the body might go about perhaps entertaining changes to make it a little more taxpayer friendly?
Well, we always need to be pursuing that direction to make it taxpayer friendly, no question about it. So we got to go back and we got to look at how we got where we did. So we were at 8% before we made a change. And initially, coming back to the legislature, I initially said, well, if we're at 8, let's just go to 6 and see how that works. And then we didn't do anything. We got down to 3.5, and I can tell you right now, 3.5 works. And it works very well. You look at the data, you look what's going out there. I know that municipalities were wringing their hands with it. And in some cases, I understand, because one thing that we haven't addressed that I think would help a lot would be to address the unfunded mandate issue. We have not, we passed my first session back. I joint authored that with Dwayne Burns. We passed it out of the House unanimously, never got a hearing in the Senate. When I talk to the county judges and when I talk to municipalities, the unfunded mandate side that is forced down there is one of the drivers with some of the costs that our local government has to to take care of because we get these mandates and they're not funded. So there's something that we can look at down the road of how can we address that. If we want to give true tax relief, we need to look at that as well, okay? And then additionally, if Senate Bill 2 continues to work as well as it is, maybe 3.5 needs to be 3.25 or 3, okay? That's a possibility. The last thing we want to do, though, is we don't want to tie the hands of local government that has to provide essential services to the communities. Because if you squeeze it too much, even though we're hearing from the constituents right now about property appraisals being high, the appraisal issue is more of a driver than anything else, okay? The tax rates, they've got a board of trustees and they've got councils that they need to hold them accountable on. But the appraisal issue is something that we have to address from that standpoint. But we will hear from constituents then if we don't have the adequate fire or police or the other things that are out there as well, okay, in those arenas. So we have to be very careful. We need to be very pragmatic about the approaches that we make. And the most important thing that we have to do is think about, and this is a military term, what second and third order effects are of major decisions that we make. I think in the civilian world, they call it unintended consequences.
Fair enough, sir, fair enough. Ellen, Representative Troxclair, I want to go to you real fast because one of the things that I noticed in the latest adopted budget for the city of Austin, and I could be wrong here, but I believe they actually reduced the average homeowner burden for folks living in the city of Austin. Now, as I started to kind of investigate what exactly was happening here, it occurred to me that perhaps as a result of SB2 or other pressures, what they were doing is simply shifting the burden to other fees, fines, and revenue sources. And so, you know, us fine folks at the foundation kind of had an idea about maybe developing a more comprehensive fiscal rule to govern some of the spending growth at the local level, which, in my opinion, is driving the entire property tax problem. Is that something that resonates with you?
Yep, you're hitting on a really important point, and I don't know what we refer to it in the civilian world because there are so many there's so many complicated tax terms. But one thing I appreciate about this audience and TPPF Policy Summit is that you guys are not afraid to get in the weeds and to dig deep. So certificates of obligation. Who knows what a certificate of obligation is? Woohoo! So that is a big part of the problem that James just outlined. Certificates of obligation are non-voter approved debt. So of course, there's straight property tax increases to fund a budget. There's bonds that can be put on the ballot to fund a specific project within certain limitations. And then there are certificates of obligation, which municipalities can issue without the approval, a huge amount, by the way, without approval from the taxpayers. And so I know that that's something that Chairman Meyer and Chairman Burrows have worked for the past several years on, and there's still more to be done. Because ultimately, when we passed, I say we, I was just a little peon cheering you guys on, testifying, you know, in favor of it. But when y'all passed Senate Bill 2, unfortunately, certificates of obligation were not included in the calculation of the 3.5%. And so it's a little bit of a loophole that probably needs to be closed. And so we are working to make sure that voters are aware that that is also contributing to their property tax increases, and that cities are really held accountable for the money that they're spending. And you know, I think we always have to go back to, hey, if you need something for an emergency or a disaster or something like that, you can always go to the taxpayers and ask and go above that 3.5%. And of course, COVID, they were able to get around it and increase. So we do need more time to see the benefit, the full benefit. But certificates of obligation, I think, are an easy way to make sure that we're really staying true to the intentions of Senate Bill 2, and that municipal governments are respecting taxpayers by making sure that debt is voter approved.
Right, and I 100% support Representative Troxclair's bill as it relates to certificates of obligation, and as soon as we can, we're going to get that heard in committee and get it out.
Thank you so much for your support.
Good to hear. And actually, Mr. Chairman, I was a fly on the wall in a interim hearing during this last interim period. I was fortunate enough to see a gentleman from Amarillo highlight some abuse with something known as tax anticipation notes. It looked like it got your attention and perhaps would be something addressed this session. Is that
Same issue with the certificates of obligation, right? They're going around what we did last session, which HB3 and SB2 with the limitations of 3.5%. We can't have that done. I mean, the prescription is, look, do not go above it, but they're trying to find, and they are getting creative with getting around that without voter approval. And so we are going to end that. That's the reason for why we have HB3 and SB2, and as Representative Shine exactly correctly stated, they're working. We need to give them more time to work, and we can't let cities and counties go around that law.
I served on the city council, and I understand COs, and I understand that there has been abuse, and I agree. What happened in Amarillo was totally unacceptable. However, a CO is a tool in the toolbox for municipalities. And you can't completely restrict a CO because you don't always have the opportunity. And again, I was a mayor pro tem for the city of Temple. And there will be things that will pop up and happen where a municipality needs a tool, and it needs to be a general obligation type instrument. And that's what a CO is. A CO, a certificate of obligation, has full faith and credit of the municipality from their taxing system, okay? But it should not be, it was never intended for what happened in Amarillo, but that was a tax anticipation note, okay? It was another way of going around the process. However, what needs to be done is to make sure that we have safeguards that are there so that COs are used for the original intent of what COs were created for. Because you don't always have, as a municipality, the opportunity to go to the electorate to get the approval for it as well, okay? So, yes, there is misuse, but at the same token, it's a tool that I think municipalities need to retain to have available for them for those things like water, like sewer, infrastructure things that may have happened, and that's important. And so I would want to make sure we protect those safeguards.
Want to ask a question on behalf of some friends that I have in the audience and on behalf of my wife, all of which are trustees in various districts. I go home occasionally and tell my wife about the good things we're about to do on tax relief, and she says, well, what are you doing on recapture? And so, Mr. Chairman, I know you have a bill on dealing with recapture. Hopefully some other folks have some thoughts as well, but can you tell us, is the body prepared to do anything meaningful on recapture?
Absolutely, and actually it is also contained in HB2, and I don't have the exact number, but I believe the recapture will be reduced by almost $4.5 billion. Go for it, James.
No, please. So a long time ago, I believe it was in the mid-1990s, then Governor Ann Richards effectively created a redistributionist system that reallocates tax revenues from some districts and gives it to other districts. And so it's Robin Hood, also known as Robin Hood. So it's a bad system that originally didn't affect a lot of people. Now it affects everyone virtually. And there's a lot of folks, both left, right, and middle, who all want to see this system done away with.
Correct, and then pursuant to HB2, and we will do those runs for each particular district and each particular member. It has a huge positive impact on reducing recaptures, I said, in excess of, I believe, $4.5 billion statewide. So HB2 also has that very, very positive impact on the state.
And just to give a little higher level summary, I think in the beginning, because we are funding schools through property taxes, which vary so wildly across the state, I think there probably was a time and place for Robin Hood that was needed and effective. I think that time has passed now when you look at the number of districts who are now giving money, especially rural school districts who may be struggling to begin with, sending money to other places, and there's not a whole lot of accountability of how that money is spent. But the great thing about Chairman Meyer's proposal is that it allows the state to cover more of the school district expenses. So by doing that, I mean, we call it buying down. We're using the state surplus to buy down your maintenance and operations portion of your property taxes. But by doing that, in and of itself, you are reducing your reliance on Robin Hood because more of the funding is coming from a central system and not necessarily directly from property taxes. So the more that we can put towards this compression, towards this property tax swap, towards using the surplus to buy down M&O, the more we are going to reduce our reliance on Robin Hood and help our districts who are pretty fed up with sending their money away from their communities.
James, let me add. I was in the legislature from '86 to '91. I got in the legislature right after Edgewood versus Kirby. I was in the debate, like we are today on property taxes and anything, about what do we do about funding schools because of Edgewood versus Kirby. It was not until 1991 that the courts dictated to the legislature that this is the way we're going to do it. And it actually began when Bill Clements was still governor, and then picked up when Ann Richards became governor, and that's when the Robin Hood took on the name. We talked about it quite a bit in the '89 legislative session, which I think was the 72nd section. And the courts took charge of that, and that's where all this recapture came from, and but it was driven by the courts. It wasn't driven by the legislature. And again, that goes back to a comment I made a moment ago when House Bill 3 was passed. The first statement I made to Representative Huberty after that was done, I said, you know, there's only a handful of us that are here that were there then that are here today, that this was finally taken out of the hands of the courts and put back into the hands of the legislature where it belongs. And I commended Representative Huberty for doing that. And now we're going to address the recapture, because all of that still needs to be the responsibility of the legislature, and we need to get that back completely in our hands and eliminate the inequity that's taking place and how that is being funded. And that's where we're going with this round.
And I want to stick with that thread for just a second. You know, one of the foundation's long-standing goals is to eliminate property tax. And in pursuit of that, we have tried to develop an incremental measure whereby we are encouraging the legislature to use surplus funds to compress school district M&O tax rates. Basically, we want to buy down those tax rates to zero. Now, in pursuit of that, one of the questions that's been raised, and I think it's very fair, is how do we land that plane? And what I mean is that a chairman recently challenged me to help articulate how it is that when we get close to zero, not necessarily when we're at zero, but when we get close to zero, how do we circumvent or address that constitutional prohibition against the imposition of a statewide property tax? And what he said to me was, basically, you're going to set up a situation where the left, primarily, is going to allege that because we've driven tax rates down so low, we now have a statewide tax. And I'm not real sure how to get around that just yet, but I'm hoping maybe someone has given some thought to that, or, you know, especially if we're looking at 25 cents worth of compression in the next biennium, we're going to kind of get to that point where we are inching toward that line. Has anybody given any thought to how we get around that Texas Constitution prohibition?
James, you're asking us to answer a question that you can't figure out yourself. You're the pro here. Yeah.
I was hoping for some help.
We look to y'all to say, hey, what are you smart people over there? What's your solution?
I guess as I look down the line, I just wonder if the legislature is going to have the appetite to take on something like that, where we're overhauling not only the property tax but school finance, so as to get to that place where we no longer have an M&O tax. And I know under HB 3 in particular, but with what the legislature is doing now with HB 2, potentially we're driving in that direction. I just wanted to highlight that.
You know, I don't know the solution, but I'm sure that one of these two guys can figure it out, right? But I think the conversation likely has to involve sales tax. And I think when any economist, most economists, I think will tell you that the fairest way to levy a tax is to have the broadest base possible, and that allows you to have the lowest tax rate possible. And so when we have a system that's so dependent on property taxes, you don't capture a lot of people who maybe are, you don't capture a lot of people in the system. But when you have and it's not based on cash flow. And so a sales tax system is based on how much you're spending, which makes sense to me, and it captures everybody who happens to be shopping, living, buying anything in Texas. So I think that's part of the equation, but But
No,
I
no,
don't know. I don't know that I know the answer to your question, but I'm looking forward to finding out.
I don't either. So I'll stop asking hard theoretical questions. Let's shift gears now and go to audience Q&A if we could. And
Oh my gosh, so many.
so if you would, given the volume of questions, let's make sure to get to our question and be respectful if we could. Yes, ma'am.
James, this might be one for you to answer, but how can we ever land the plane on eliminating property taxes and possibly moving towards a consumption-based tax if the legislature is talking about reviving 313s?
Well, I'll take it. Okay. Number one, sales tax regressive. You have a recession in the economy, your sales tax revenues are going to go down. We do not have an income tax in Texas. We're not going to have one because we have a constitutional amendment that prohibits an income tax. Very good thing. Okay. You look across the United States and you look the way that we fund government across the United States. Texas is one of 6 states without an income tax. Every state has a property tax. I think 1 or 2 states don't have a sales tax, but they have income taxes and they make up for it with sales tax as well. You look at how government is funded across the globe, and you have a VAT tax or consumption tax in Europe. The average tax that folks pay in Europe is about 50%. And that tax is applied at each level in the growth of how a product gets to the market. Okay? So my position is, and looking at this, is I believe there's always going to have to be a place for property tax to some degree because we don't have an income tax. So we only have 2 legs to the 3-legged stool. And the sales tax that we have is functioning very well because of the growth that we have in the state of Texas. And that's why we have the surplus we have. And because of the oil and gas industry being as important as it is to the United States and to the state, those severance taxes are going to continue to come in, and anything we do from funding government has to be sustainable. We can't make decisions to lower the cost down of government to such a point with surpluses that the next biennium we are faced with a decision of having to raise taxes in order to fund government that's there. Government essential services. And that's the way I look at it from a broad perspective in that regards. I don't think Texas wants to have a sales tax that's somewhere in the teens, and I don't think we want to be the only state in the union that would have a VAT tax like Europe. I just don't see that happening.
Yeah.
So I'm a school board member in a very large school district in Texas. I have yet to vote yes on any budget or yes on any of their tax rates that they want. I'm always a no vote. And I'll tell you, my question is as a homeowner. I heard Dan Patrick yesterday talking about wanting to raise the homestead exemption to $70,000. A year or 2 ago, my husband and I are looking at our tax bill, and we see that it went down. We're trying to figure out why. We reverse engineer it, and we realize it's because the legislature raised the exemption from $25,000 to $40,000. It doesn't sound like that's just $15,000, but that actually made a difference in our tax bill. So when I see the Senate wanting to move in that direction up to 70, that's very appealing because I've seen it play out. You say that people don't come up to you, but if you look at it, that made a difference. And I'm concerned about the House's approach that you're talking about by wanting to, I mean, of course it sounds good to roll 10% back to 5%, but that doesn't really help a new homeowner who's going to come in and have to be appraised and pay their taxes at what homes are selling for today. So I hope that you guys haven't, my question, let me as a form of a question. do you guys have an open mind to work with your Senate partners to make sure that meaningful tax reform comes, or are we just going to butt heads over the process and
No,
the approach?
absolutely. And the speaker actually addressed this yesterday. I mean, I think in his remarks, he even said, look, we're not shutting the door on homestead exemptions. We do see the benefit. In fact, I'm sure Ms. Shaw and I both voted for and fully supported the increase from 25 to 40. What we're talking about are just different approaches. I mean, that's just it. And so, therefore, as I stated before, we're going to have a discussion. It's going to go on from now until the close of session on how best we as a House and a Senate provide you property tax relief. And so therefore, that's a discussion we're going to continue to have. Right now, we truly do believe the appraisal cap, because it is not just homeowners. It is decreasing to 5% for homeowners, but then also getting that farmer, getting that rancher, getting that small business owner who currently there are no caps on how much their appraisal can go up. So we in the House want to take that approach to give the broadest base property tax relief we can. That being said, as the speaker said yesterday, the door is still open. We just believe the House's version is the best idea.
So how many folks out there are married? How many of you and your spouse agree 100% of the time on every decision you make? There are 100 and, oh, there's one. He's not married though. My point is there are 184 people in the process. 150 House members, 31 senators, a lieutenant governor, and a governor. We have to come together, and we have to work in that system, and it's called compromise. You know, Senator Graham, good friend of mine, and I work very closely with Senator Graham, and I think he's had some relationships with TPPF. And we spent a lot of time together years and years ago. When I was in Washington, I was a Reagan appointee, and learned a lot from that man, a great economist. And here's something that there was an editorial, and if you haven't seen the editorial, you need to see it. He said that when he became a U.S. Senator, he said everything that he had to deal with, he always wanted to do what was best for the broad aspects of the country and the nation. And he said, I don't know that I ever voted for anything that didn't have at least one thing in it I didn't like. And he went to President Reagan in this editorial when they were working on the budget and laid out to the president and expressed to him, too, that there was a deal trying to get the budget plan with the sugar, whatever it was, for Louisiana. And it was a detestable piece of legislation. But if they didn't put it in the bill, they were not going to be able to increase defense spending and to lower taxes and to do a number of other things that needed to happen for the betterment of the United States of America. And he said, and I convinced President Reagan that sometimes you have to have something in there in the compromise that gets the bigger picture done. That's where I come from. And that's where a lot of members of the House come from as well. I can't speak for the Senate. They're on the east side. I've always felt like the west side was where the sun sets, and that's where God's country really is, okay? Because I was a House member when I was there before, and when I returned, I'm a House member, and I think the House is closest to the people. We hear more, and we interact more with the folks at the lower level. So those kind of things, I think, are important to consider as we go about the process of working with the Senate, working with business, working with those who may have difference of opinions. You never shut the door. You always keep the dialogue going. But at some point in time, you have to fish or cut bait, and sometimes that means you may have something that's in a piece of legislation that you may have to vote for in order to get the bigger picture accomplished.
Yes, sir.
Vincent Monapuente out of Fort Worth, Texas. When we're talking about a reduction in property tax, I've got two parts to the question. Pretty simple. Are we talking about across the board, no matter the value of the business, of the home or the business? Because some of us have got higher property tax, lower property tax. Yes, I may make more money than the other person, but I have other obligations like making a donation to TPPF, so I need that money. And then the second part of that is, we keep talking about because of the surplus, but whatever y'all are talking about, it's permanent. You're not going to tie it to the surplus, correct? So two parts. Is it across the board?
Yes, sir. It's across the board, and yes, it's a go forward as well. The one thing none of us want to do is provide a very temporary relief, right? Like to provide it for the next 2 years, and then for your rates to pop back up again, and your taxes go back up. This is a compression of 25 cents in HB2 and HB1. But again, tying it back to the appraisal caps, that's part of it. We want to cap how much your appraisals are going up, because that truly, in my worldview, is the villain in all this, is the appraisals eat up a lot of what we do. So even when we compress your taxes and they go back down, if your appraisal skyrockets, then you don't ever see the benefit of it. And so that's why we're tying the two things together. But those are the answers to your question.
James, let me add something real quick. Back in 1989, we increased the sales tax. It was temporary. That's right. It was sold to be a temporary increase. It's still the same today it was back then.
Yes. Yes, ma'am. This young lady right here in the middle.
I love your historical perspective. It's really, I mean, if we don't have it, we're doomed to repeat it. So thank you.
I'm an old guy.
Yes, ma'am.
Jane Kinsino from Lubbock, and my question is, right now for seniors over 65, the school taxes are frozen. In this new rearrangement of taxes and it going down, are seniors going to get any benefits, or is that it? What we have, we've already had it frozen. It hadn't been going up on the largest part of our tax bill. So, what are y'all thinking on that issue?
Again, I feel like but the appraisals, I mean, where your taxes are continuing to go up, right, is when your appraisal continues to go up. And so where you're going to see a very good benefit is we're decreasing the amount your appraisal can go up by 50%. And so therefore, that's where you and others are going to see that benefit, because again, the appraisals to me are really what we must tackle. And so that's where you will see that benefit.
And the school portion is a big part of your property tax bill, but it's not the entire thing. So you're still, it's not frozen for the city, for the community college district, for all the other taxing entities that you're paying into. So the appraisal cap will benefit all those other parts of your property tax bill.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So my name is Carla Sierra with the Libet Initiative, and thank you all for being here. It's been great to hear everything that you are trying to do for property taxes. Over the last summer, Libet actually helped constituents in El Paso halt a $390 million proposal from our county hospital. So, we used the legislation that you passed in 2019 to collect all those signatures. So the minimum for us was 25,000 signatures in 45 days. We actually collected over 30,000, and folks in El Paso are asking, is the goal during this session to actually completely do away with COs, which is a loophole, that our taxing entities can use? And I'll give you an example. Our county recently passed $100 million in COs, and they split up the CO, because that would mean that constituents would have to collect double the amount of signatures, which doesn't seem fair, right? I mean, they're essentially continuing to find loopholes. So is the goal during the session to eliminate COs completely and tax anticipation notes, or is the goal to modify the legislation that was already passed in 2019 so that it makes it easier for constituents to stop something like this?
Thank you for clarifying that, or asking a clarifying question. I think my goal is to not eliminate COs, but to ensure that debt that is issued as a part of a certificate of obligation is included in the calculation of the rollback rate or the new tax rate or whatever we're calling it now. So that 3.5% right now, that calculation holds harmless any new growth. 3.5% is from existing, and then COs would also be included in that calculation. So not doing away with them, but allowing a little bit more restraint and transparency in including them in the 3.5%. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And the other thing is, I know myself and Representative Troxclair and Representative Shine would welcome your type of input. Come to our office after this, because these type of person, if they're dividing it up to circumvent, that is something we can absolutely stop. That's absurd, right? I mean, that's the whole point. And so please come talk to us. And I encourage anyone here the same. If you have a personal experience that can help us write better legislation, we all three want to hear it, because that is the type of activity that we want to stop.
It's abuses like you're describing that get people wanting to take away tools that have really been in the past very useful and important. Tax anticipation notes. Money doesn't come in to municipalities on a regular scale like a pension plan payment to you if you're retired, or income statement from an investment or something like that. Taxes come in at different periods and different times. Municipalities have to have TANs. What Amarillo did with their TANs was, I said a moment ago, was just totally absurd, okay? How in the world they got away with that, with a financial advisor for municipalities that advised them to do it or something like that? They should be held accountable, you know, above and beyond whatever constraints there should be for that person to practice that type of consultation and consulting, okay? But TANs are, you got revenue anticipated notes and you got tax anticipated notes. Municipalities have to have those things. Just because the fact that revenues don't come in on a regular scale, and they have to continue to function to pay government on a routine basis. So again, safeguards need to be there, but you can't afford to eliminate them either, or you're going to have mass pandemonium.
Yes, sir.
Hello, Ben Moss in San Antonio, Texas. As a realtor, every year people are protesting their taxes. You can do a CMA and all that kind of stuff to justify. Would it make more sense just to have a lower, you apply for a homestead exemption, you have a lower tax just in general, and then we don't have to clog up the system. The appraisal system, you know, the appraisal district is always tied up from spring to summer. And so, and you know, instead of giving a rebate, just make it a homestead. This is your homestead, and because of that, it's at this tax rate, which is lower than anything else.
Well, that would be difficult to do. I've studied the tax system extensively, and believe me, I want to see a very accountable, transparent, and system that works very well for all of us, because everyone in this room, I presume, pays taxes. And even if you don't own a piece of property and you're renting, you're still paying it, even if you're a leasee, okay? So you got to look at in Article 8 of the Constitution with the equal and uniform and how all this is put together and the way the system is. You're talking, in order to do that, you would have to make a dramatic change in the entire system itself and how it functions and how it works. We need to keep equal and uniform there. This is why I really like the idea of using the average value of the appraised value of homesteads in a particular county. A lady asked a question a moment ago of living in their home for an extended period of time. If you have, as you have the creep of appraisals going up, those people who are older, who tend to live in their homes for an extended period of time, actually, as if you're using the average value of the property that's in the county, that means the exemption is going to continue to go up with the appraisal creep, and those folks who are most affected, whose homes are not part of that process, end up with a greater exemption and end up getting to a point where they may, in fact, have a very small property tax signature that they'll have to be responsible for. I think those are the kind of things that actually work best.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Patrick Johnson with Frontier Bank of Texas. I've got a question about another type of property tax, which is my utility bill. I live in the outskirts of the city of Austin and pay Austin Energy each month, and Austin Energy receives $115 million more than it needs to provide me energy, and then gives that to the city so that the council can use it for its pet projects. What can the state do to hold these monopolies accountable for overcharging all income levels for utilities, which is essentially a tax? And I just wanted to see what we could do at the state level to address this, especially given that we're certainly not getting the service levels we need from Austin Energy.
I mean, I could talk for an hour on this subject. It's hard to, you know, I'm so excited that I've been talking about this since the first time I ever ran. So it's exciting that it's kind of being moved to the front burner, especially after we've seen the extensive outages that we have seen. Long story short, you are absolutely right. The Austin Energy is a vertically integrated utility. It is illegal to own in any other part of the state, 85% of Texas, for 85% of Texas in the deregulated market, it is illegal for a utility to own the transmission line as well as the generation and the retail sales because of the potential for misuse. On top of that, Austin Energy is the largest municipally owned utility in the state that if you have a problem, do you know who serves as the board of directors, who you would go to complain to? The Austin City Council, who is the people who set the rate in the first place. So I can speak on this as a former board member of Austin Energy, that I wasn't necessarily qualified to serve on the board of directors of such a major utility. So yes, I am working on a series of bills. We will be filing them next week in advance of the bill filing deadline to give more transparency, accountability, to stop the transfer, to allow Austin Energy customers to protest their rates and services to the Public Utility Commission. And ultimately, in my perfect world, we would have an independent board of utility experts running the utility separate from the Austin City Council, as well as the ability for Austinites to ultimately choose who is providing electricity to your home and deregulation of the retail side of it. So yes, big changes coming up. I would love for you to contact my office because we would love to have you come and speak when this bill gets to committee.
So stay tuned. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask you if it might be beneficial to change the terminology with regards to the 3.5% revenue cap and change that to 3.5% election trigger, because a lot of the municipalities like to suggest that it's the legislature that's causing this.
Yeah, I mean, we're open to absolutely open to any ideas, because I think to your point, we want folks to understand what is actually going on, which is making sure that the voters are approving of what you're doing. So absolutely.
By the way, the simplification of the tax jargon was something that SB2 in 2019 did a little bit. We definitely applauded that, and we hope to see more of that in this session too.
And very quickly, I think it was really TML who came during the passage of Senate Bill 2 and kept calling it a cap. And to Representative Shine's point, you know, sometimes when you have these organizations say that the sky is going to fall and that everything is going to be ruined, you give it a couple years and it actually works out okay. So that's a note of caution as we go into the hardest part of this legislative session, that it's hard to make big changes, but it's necessary, and we need to be able to work together in a productive and constructive manner instead of just saying no.
Yes, sir.
James, I want to thank you because you, in bringing up making all of these reforms sustainable and something that we can do moving forward, you already addressed the spending question, so you actually anticipated my primary question. And while I might replace the phrase slow the growth of with 90% cut, that's we're still directionally moving in the same way. My question for the panel, since my main area was actually already addressed, is if you want to take a step back at it and look at it a little bit more in a longer term historical perspective, isn't the ultimate lesson of Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump that until Republicans develop the political will to tackle spending, any and all tax relief will ultimately be temporary?
I would have to say spending should always be the first point of consideration before we make any decisions about additional revenue. We always should fund what we need first, and if we have money left over, then we look at the wants.
And there was a big piece of legislation that was passed last session. You can maybe speak to it better than I can, but that TPPF supported, that was a constitutional spending limit. No, population plus inflation. So the state did put a really important spending limit in place that will help the state to make sure that it is growing within its means going forward.
One of the interesting dichotomies that exist in Texas is that state government is actually subject to 4 constitutional spending limits plus the statutory spending limit that the body graciously adopted last session, but local governments have no similar fiscal rules in place. So
Except that 3.5% on municipalities, because they do have that limit unless the voters approve it.
So yes, sir, that on property tax revenues, but in terms of the spending, there's really no similar limitation in place. I believe we have time for one last question. I apologize, audience. I'm starting to get dirty looks from our events team. But Mr. Mayfield, if you would, we've got one last question here in the front.
I'm Robert Mayfield, and I have Dairy Queens in the Austin area. And some of you people that are here maybe are not in small business, maybe just own a home or something like that. But there's there's several kinds of property taxes. And one of them, an obnoxious one, I think, is a tax separately on inventory, equipment, and fixtures, okay? I mean, you know, that's pretty tough for a business sometimes. Just this last year, we paid $37,000 in that kind of tax. So, you know, what could we do with that? It started out as our
Yeah, so
money.
that is also another tool. I mean, when we're discussing tax relief, it is property tax relief, but I have to tell you, I've certainly had a number of small business owners come in and tell me the same thing. And it's interesting because when I first was elected, I heard a lot about the franchise tax, and there's discussion about cutting that or doing away with that as well. But now I'm hearing from a ton of small businesses about the burden that the inventory tax is providing. So we are absolutely looking at that this session as well, sir.
Well, it's kind of, I would even say evil, because some counties are worse than others. You know, it's almost the same as the real estate. Unbelievable. And so I think James or somebody was saying, what do you do to stop it from happening again? Well, how about killing it? You know?
Yeah, it's a small business personal property tax exemption. Had a bill on that last year, and we'll look at it again this year. It's a proposal that would exempt personal property on taxpayers with $100,000 or less. Because the problem that you have in small business, in the first 3 years of those businesses' existence, they're struggling to make it anyway.
Yep.
And if they don't have an exemption, that may have a point where after 3 years or 5 years, that exemption may go away, but at least have that exemption there for the purpose of them to help startups. And I think that's probably something that should be considered.
Yes, sir. And just because we've been focusing on HB2, realize, so I believe last session, my committee, Ways and Means, had the second most bills come to our committee in any committee in the entire House. I suspect that we may be number one this time. So just because we're focusing on HB2 and that great piece of legislation, there are going to be a lot of other bills that come through our committee to discuss how we can help Texans every day.
There's a one word for that. It's called hallelujah.
Thanks.
Folks, help me thank these fine lawmakers for being so gracious with their time.